All right, today's video is one of those where doing the right thing doesn't exactly go the way you'd expect. We've got someone who spoke up for a kid and paid for it with their job, a workplace where management pushed things so far people just walked out, and a neighbor who tried to turn their own mistake into a lawsuit and got shut down hard. These are the kind of stories where people either fold or decide they're not going to play along anymore. Let's get into it. I spoke up about a misdiagnosed kid. They fired me for it. After my last stretch working in an IT department, I hit a point where I just couldn't do it anymore. The constant tickets, the same recycled problems, and the feeling that nothing you fixed actually mattered long-term wore me down. So I made what I thought was a meaningful pivot. I took a job working with institutionalized teenagers in an open facility, the kind meant for kids who were struggling but not completely beyond help. My logic was simple. If I was going to deal with problems, I wanted them to be human ones, not printer errors and password resets. The place had a mix of staff, therapists, social workers, and assistants like me. I didn't have a formal background in psychology, but I wasn't walking in blind either. I'd lived with a specific diagnosis myself for years, and I knew what it looked like when it was handled properly and when it wasn't. During my first few weeks, I mostly observed, trying to understand how things worked and how the kids responded to different staff members. That's when one particular boy caught my attention. He was quiet in a way that didn't match the file I'd briefly seen on him. According to the paperwork, he had a diagnosis that I knew well, but the way he behaved didn't line up with it. What did stand out was how heavily medicated he seemed. He was sluggish, unfocused, and often looked like he was fighting to stay present. The more I watched him, the more it felt like the medication wasn't helping him at all. If anything, it seemed to be flattening him into something he wasn't. About a month in, I brought it up during a team meeting. I tried to keep it professional. I've been observing him, I said, and I don't think his current diagnosis fits. Also, the medication seems to be making things worse, not better. The reaction was immediate and cold. One of the senior staff members cut in with, "You don't have the qualifications to make that kind of assessment." Another added, "We rely on professional evaluations, not personal impressions." I tried to explain that I wasn't speaking out of nowhere, that I actually have the same diagnosis he was supposed to have, and I recognized the differences. That didn't help. If anything, it made them more dismissive. The meeting moved on like I hadn't said anything of value. Later, one of the few decent colleagues pulled me aside and said quietly, "It's not about whether you're right, it's about who's allowed to be right." That told me everything I needed to know about how decisions were made there. 2 weeks later, we had an external oversight review. It was one of those mandatory evaluations where an outside professional comes in to go through cases, treatment plans, and updates. Everyone was suddenly very attentive. Files were being organized, and people who usually coasted were suddenly double-checking their notes. We went through the kids one by one, discussing progress and next steps. When it came time to review this particular boy, the room went strangely quiet. The supervisor pulled up his file and started summarizing. "He's currently on medication for his diagnosis, and we're monitoring his response," he said, but his tone was hesitant. The oversight officer, a woman who clearly knew her field, asked a few follow-up questions. "Any recent observations or concerns?" she asked. The supervisor glanced around and then said something vague along the lines of, "If there's anything relevant, now would be the time to mention it." I knew what that meant, even if he didn't say it directly. I also knew my earlier concerns weren't in the file, so I spoke up. "There is something relevant," I said. Every head in the room turned toward me, and the looks I got were anything but encouraging. The oversight officer nodded. "Go ahead," she said. So I laid it out. I explained what I'd observed, how the boy's behavior didn't align with his diagnosis, and how the medication seemed to be suppressing rather than helping him. I also mentioned that I'd brought this up previously and that it hadn't been documented. The room felt tense enough to snap. The oversight officer listened carefully, then asked a few specific questions that made it clear this was her area of expertise. After a short pause, she closed the file and said, "Based on what I'm hearing, I want his medication reviewed immediately. In fact, I recommend discontinuing it for now and reassessing his condition without that influence." There was no argument from her side, just a firm decision. The staff who dismissed me earlier suddenly had nothing to say. It was like the authority they'd relied on had shifted out from under them. Within a week, the difference in the boy was noticeable. He was still dealing with his own issues, but he was more alert, more engaged, and more himself. He started participating in activities he'd previously avoided and even had moments where he seemed genuinely present. It wasn't a miracle fix, but it was clear that removing the medication had helped him more than anything we'd been doing before. A few days after that, I was called into the office. The conversation was short and carefully worded. They said my trial period wasn't working out and that they were letting me go. No specific reason was given, but I didn't need one spelled out. Challenging the internal hierarchy, even when you're right, isn't something that tends to be rewarded. As I was packing up my things, trying to process the whole situation, I heard someone running down the hallway. The boy came straight up to me and wrapped his arms around me in a quick, tight hug. He didn't say much, just something like, "Thanks," before one of the staff gently pulled him away. That moment stuck with me more than the termination did. I left that place without a job, but also without any real regret about what I'd said. A few years later, I heard through the grapevine that the company running that facility had gone under. Apparently, they'd lost contracts and stopped receiving new placements after a series of issues came to light. Missing something as obvious as a misdiagnosis didn't help their reputation. I never found out what happened to that kid in the long run. I'd like to think he ended up somewhere that actually paid attention to what he needed instead of forcing him into a box that didn't fit. As for me, that experience taught me more about people than any IT job ever did. Sometimes the system isn't broken because it doesn't know better. It's broken because it refuses to listen when someone does. You lost your job, but you gained something the staff who fired you will never have: the trust of a kid who needed someone to speak up. That hug was worth more than a paycheck, and the system that fired you, it collapsed under its own weight a few years later. Some places don't fail despite being broken. They fail because they refuse to be fixed. And our second story. Sub-supervisor wanted us to use our phones. We used our rights instead. Some years ago, I did a brief stint as a mail carrier with the Postal Service. Every Sunday, people were mandated to come in on rotation to do Amazon deliveries, and the rotation was usually split in two groups, 1-to-3 ratio, with one person from the tenured carriers and 3 people from the contract carriers per branch, with 3 to 4 branches reporting to our location as we were the sorting hub. That particular Sunday, we had the following complications. All 4 people from my branch were new/contract carriers, including myself, because it was Labor Day weekend and the tenured folks could not be mandated in. This was only my second Sunday delivery, and I hadn't really been trained. Our postmaster was subbing in at an out-of-state location, so we had someone filling in for her. The sub-postmaster was out this day, so we had one of the lower supervisors filling in for him. A sub for the sub. This person had just come back from a 2-month suspension for threatening to kill someone. In writing. Our scanners weren't working that day, which also meant the auto-generated routes weren't populating on them. Because it was Sunday, they were dynamic routes that changed every week based on what packages we had/where they were going. We had to go by printed routes with no directions on them. When we brought it up to the sub-supervisor that the scanner GPS wasn't working, she told us to just use your phones. We were like, what? No, absolutely not. It's bullcrap to expect us to use our personal devices as work equipment and not get compensated for us, especially for those of us who don't have unlimited data plans. She insisted, so we called our union reps from our respective branches, who told us we were well within our rights to pack up and go home, but that we'd not get paid for the day. But if we stayed and couldn't finish, we'd get paid the full day plus any overtime. 3 people walked out and went home, and I don't blame them. But it did mean the rest of us had to pick up their slack. I stayed because I couldn't afford to lose the pay. I did warn the supervisor that as a young femme-presenting person, I didn't feel comfortable going without any sort of communications, so as soon as my phone died, I'd be coming back and going home, regardless of how many packages I still had left. She brushed me off, but off I went. Sure enough, my phone died around 3 p.m. I messaged her when I had 1% left and told her I was on my way back. She frantically tried reaching out to me to tell me she figured out the GPS and was sending another carrier out to meet me to show me how to do it on my scanner. I ignored them. When I returned, she tried to write me up for insubordination/refusal to deliver. I refused to sign the write-up and wrote my own undeliverable report detailing everything that had happened, including the instructions she gave and what our union rep told us. She refused to sign that in retaliation. I took her pen and wrote, "Manager refused to sign acknowledgement" in all caps, and called the rep back right in front of her to let them know I'd be filing a grievance the next day, and went to go unload my truck. As I was unloading, I saw other carriers also coming back and having the same conversation with her. Apparently, they'd heard me tell her in the morning what I planned to do and decided to do the same. The sub-postmaster and the district postmaster both had to come in to finish delivering the packages. I quit not long after this, but I heard from other carriers she was fired by the end of the year. I now have a newfound understanding for the bullcrap the mail carriers put up with and have since started leaving snacks/waters for my mail carriers. The final image is perfect. The sub-postmaster and district postmaster, the bosses of the bosses, had to deliver the packages themselves because the supervisor drove away everyone who actually knew how to do the job. She was fired by the end of the year. You quit, but you also changed how you treat mail carriers forever. That's not just a story about a bad supervisor. It's a story about empathy earned through experience. You saw the system fail from the inside, and you decided to be the person who makes it better, one bottle of water at a time. The snacks are small, but they mean everything to someone who's been told, "Just use your phone," and sent out into the heat with no GPS and no backup. You didn't just survive the bullcrap, you learned from it. And now your mail carrier knows someone out there gets it. And our last story. Neighbor's kid destroyed my fountain, got hurt. Now they're suing me for $10,000. I've lived in my house for almost 8 years, and it's one of those quiet suburban streets where nothing ever really happens. I'm not overly social, but I get along fine with most of the neighbors. My front yard isn't anything fancy, but I did put a bit of effort into it over the years, including a decorative stone fountain that sat right in the center. This thing was solid, about 3 feet tall, and heavy enough that you wouldn't casually knock it over unless you were actively trying. That fountain had been there for years without a single issue. Kids walked by it, adults admired it, nobody treated it like playground equipment. So when I heard a loud crash one afternoon while I was working from home, followed immediately by a child screaming, it didn't even register at first that it had anything to do with my yard. I ran outside and saw 2 kids from down the street standing in my lawn looking panicked. One of them was on the ground crying, and my fountain was tipped over on its side, partially resting on his leg. I rushed over and carefully moved the fountain off him, trying not to make things worse. There was some blood, enough to look alarming, but it didn't seem life-threatening. I grabbed my phone and called emergency services right away. Within a few minutes, the parents came running out of their house, which, to my surprise, meant they'd been home the entire time while their kids were wandering around. Paramedics arrived, checked the boy out, and took him to urgent care. It turned out he needed a few stitches and had a nasty bruise, but no broken bones. It could have been much worse. That evening, I texted the mother just to check in. "Hey, just wanted to see how he's doing," I wrote. She replied with a short, "He'll be fine." And that was it. No accusations, no hostility, just a brief answer. I figured the situation, while unfortunate, was over. Accidents happen, kids do dumb things, and we all move on. I even started looking into getting the fountain repaired, although it was pretty clear the damage was significant. About 3 weeks later, I came home from running errands and found an envelope taped to my door. It was a court summons. The neighbor was suing me for $10,000, claiming medical expenses, emotional distress, and something labeled as loss of enjoyment of life for her son. I stood there reading it twice just to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding. Her entire argument boiled down to the idea that I had been negligent for not securing my fountain, as if I should have anticipated that someone else's kids would climb on it without permission. Her kids trespassed, damaged her property, and got hurt. Instead of taking responsibility, she looked for someone to blame and found you. $10,000 for emotional distress and loss of enjoyment of life is a bold ask from someone who didn't even know where her children were. She wasn't seeking justice, she was looking for a payout. I called a lawyer for a consultation, half expecting him to tell me I was in trouble. Instead, after hearing the full story, he let out a short laugh and said, "You might actually want to consider a counterclaim." That caught my attention. He explained that the kids were on my property without permission and their actions directly caused damage. He said the parents' lack of supervision was going to be a major factor, especially since they admitted they didn't even know where their children were at the time. So I filed a counterclaim for the cost of replacing the fountain and the labor involved in removing what was left and installing a new one. It came out to about $1,500. I documented everything, photos of the yard, the fountain before and after, timestamps, even the text message exchange where I checked on her son. If this was going to court, I wasn't going in unprepared. The situation escalated the next day when the neighbor showed up at my door, furious. She didn't knock politely, she pounded on the door like I owed her something. When I opened it a crack, she immediately launched into a rant about how I was attacking her family and victimizing her son again. I cut her off and told her calmly, "You filed a lawsuit." I responded, "That's how this works." She didn't like that answer and kept shouting, so I shut the door and called the police. They showed up, had a short conversation with her, and told her to stay off my property. The day of the hearing finally came, and the whole thing felt surreal. We both showed up, sat in a small courtroom, and waited for our turn. The judge was an older woman who looked like she had zero patience for nonsense. The neighbor went first. She got emotional quickly, talking about how her son was traumatized, how he had nightmares, and how I had created a dangerous environment by having a heavy object a child could climb. The judge listened without interrupting, then asked a simple question: "Did you know your children were on his property at the time of the incident?" The neighbor hesitated and then admitted she did not. The judge followed up with, "So they were unsupervised." There was a long pause before she quietly said yes. The tone in the room shifted right there. When it was my turn, I kept it straightforward. I showed the photos, explained how long the fountain had been there without issue, and pointed out that it required someone to actively climb onto it for it to tip. I also mentioned that I had never given permission for the kids to be on my property and that I had acted immediately to help when the accident happened. The judge asked if there was any evidence the children had been invited onto my property. The neighbor admitted there wasn't. The ruling came quickly. The judge dismissed the neighbor's claim entirely and then ruled in my favor on the counterclaim. I was awarded the full amount for the fountain replacement, along with court costs. The neighbor started crying again, and the judge told her very clearly to compose herself or risk being held in contempt. Walking out of that courtroom, I didn't feel victorious so much as relieved. I replaced the fountain a few weeks later, this time anchoring it more securely just to avoid any future nonsense. The neighbor hasn't spoken to me since, which honestly suits me just fine. It's amazing how quickly someone will try to shift blame when their own lack of supervision catches up with them. Out of all three, the first story hits the hardest. No contest. Because this one isn't about winning an argument or getting even. It's about someone choosing to say something when it actually mattered. They knew it wouldn't go over well. They'd already been shut down once, but when the moment came, they spoke anyway. And that changed something real for that kid. And yeah, it cost them their job. But that last moment, the kid running up, hugging them, and saying thank you, that's the kind of thing you don't forget. Some places run on hierarchy, not truth, and once you challenge that, you're already on borrowed time. But every now and then, doing the right thing isn't about the outcome, it's about not staying quiet when you know better. Hey guys, thank you all for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.